Thank you. My freedom defense talk. Okay, it will not actually be precisely what Jan has announced, so it will not be a critique of socialist planning in the name of freedom. I will, however, critique the initial thesis of this panel, namely that there's something that advances in communicational and informational technology could decisively change the field of debate in the direction of the plan that was to keep the scales. I don't think the dilemma of market versus plan is it's not technological, so I don't think the technological advancement have much effect, can affect it much. Well, I will start. I will repeat a bit what Jan has also already started. I will start with a recap of the socialist calculation debate. So, debate between future neoliberal legends from Mises and Hayek on one side and socialist economist Oskar Lange on the other. That happened in the 30s, so that was in the aftershock of the Great Depression and therefore in the climate of serious ideological weakness of liberal capitalism. But first, as a background, a couple of words on Leon Walras. Leon Walras was one of the initiators of so-called marginalist revolution and thereby one of the founders of neoclassical paradigm, i.e. actually founder of modern economics in general. And his main contribution was that he produced a formal model of how market equilibrium is to be achieved if every participant has precise knowledge of his productive capabilities and precise knowledge of his desires. How did Walras do it? He described market as an auction process in which, in successive steps, every market participant announces how much output he's willing to produce at a given price and how much he's willing to buy at a given price. And Walras' contribution was that he proved that with successive steps, when every market participant offers prices and demands amounts, they converge. A situation arises where for every particular commodity, a price is settled at which supply and demand for that commodity are the same. And this is the equilibrium. That was the theoretical background. So years later, as I said, in the 30s, when socialism was all the rage, Ludwig von Mises came along and said that in a society where all the means of production are concentrated in public ownership, then obviously there is no capital markets, therefore there is no price of capital, and hence it is impossible to determine what is profitable or not, or what is more or less profitable, and hence it is impossible to rationally determine which of the possible allocation of resources is optimal. If we use the criteria of rationality as outlined by Walras. And then Oskar Lange attacked on this point and proved the contrary. And his solution to the Mises challenge was in fact very simple. That central planning board can, after all, just simulate the process of market as described by Walras. Precisely because you had such a formally well-described model of how market reaches its ideal state, you don't actually need the market to happen. You can just do the algorithm itself. So here Lange proved that no, in fact, the calculation is not the problem. But for the next step of the debate, it took quite a while, namely for Hayek to come up with a counterattack. In 1945, yes, he defended again the market by decisively changing the terrain of battle. Namely, Hergouth argued that the problem of planning isn't the impossibility of calculation, but something more basic, impossibility of the very gathering of information in some certain planning bureau, or indeed in any single consciousness. To quote, the peculiar character of problem of rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that the knowledge of the circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess. The economic problem of society is thus not narrowly a problem how to allocate given resources. It is a problem of the utilization of knowledge, which is not given to anyone in its totality, unquote. So, planning fails because it cannot integrate the resource of dispersed social knowledge. Knowledge that is specific to the time and circumstance of each individual, and it is uncommunicable to any central instance. Now, we have to observe that quite a lot, in fact, changes with this Hayek's shift in the terms of the debate. First, it has to be said that Hayek's depiction of capitalist economy sounds a bit more realistic than the equilibrium one. If nothing else, it is only in Hayek's picture of capitalist economy, only Hayek's picture of capitalist economy includes the dimension of change, of constant transformation of capitalist economy, where individual actors are finding new and new holes, new and new opportunities in the existing state of things that they are able to exploit with their specific, local, particular knowledge. In the classical formulation of equilibrium markets, this aspect of change was in fact present only as a pure externality. There was no account given of it at all. Also, what is dropped in Hayek's argumentation is an account, is emphasis on perfection and optimality of markets. Rather, in Hayek's argument, markets are constantly imperfect, at least in regard to future situation that market participant attempts to create. So they always include the moment of imperfection as an opportunity to action. And finally, and most decisively, I will argue that Hayek, but without explicitly saying so, I'm a bit developing the consequences of his thought here, that Hayek outlines a totally new sort of justification of the market that in fact even ceases to be justification in the proper sense. Because with Hayek's argument, the claim that market capitalism works best is de facto abandoned. Because the very qualification of works best stops making sense. Namely, since Hayek asserts the impossibility of centralized concentration of knowledge about economy, there also cannot be any overweening standpoint that would determine that the outcome that happened was indeed the best. Rather, Hayek is saying more like something, market works because it works, or something like the market capitalism is good not because it produces the best outcome, but because it produces a good conditions for further perpetuation of activity. So I think that only with Hayek's argument did capitalism get a narrative that truly captures its dispersed, dissolved character, where the market participant is constantly in antagonistic relationship to the rest of social totality. Central plan and equilibrium markets, on the other hand, could be shown to be essentially isomorphic conceptions of economy, insofar as in both cases a total reconciliation of individual and society as a whole is achieved. With that Hayek's narration, we have to note that he did present a rather hard objection for a potential proponent of the plan to refute. But in fact, in the meantime, he also changed the route of debate so much that one cannot say that he actually won. There just is no more common ground for the agreement that would convince one side or refute the other. However, I think that he did, in a way, better capture the reality of functioning of markets, and therefore it is also today anachronistic to debate whether a plan is better than market or not. This misses the crucial point, because it should be recognized that markets and market behavior has a certain way of proliferating regardless of and in defiance of any deliberation of what is general good. There seems to be something peculiar about the position of individual in regard to social totality in market society. That is, there is something peculiar about the ethical spirit of markets. So, at this point, I will go and underline a certain moral dimension of this debate about the market. Namely, as also Hayek quickly notes, his concept of local knowledge, this local, uncommunicable, tacit knowledge, has somewhat morally shady dimension to it. Quote, It's a curious fact, this sort of knowledge should today be generally regarded with kind of contempt, and that everyone who by such knowledge gains an advantage over somebody better equipped with theoretical or technical knowledge is thought to have acted almost disreputably. To gain an advantage from better knowledge of facilities of communication, transport, is sometimes regarded as almost dishonest. Although it is quite important that society make use of the best opportunities in this respect, as in using the latest scientific discoveries. This prejudice has in considerable measure affected the attitude toward commerce in general compared with that toward production, unquote. And if you think about it in general, given that our society has been decisively based on market economy for 200 years and more, it is the superstructure of our society has retained surprisingly large amounts of anti-market sentiments in its moral and aesthetic sensibilities. And throughout the history, we have this idea that markets are something somewhat degenerate, that they are morally deficient, less worthy than a direct universal service to the state. For the most classical example, you can just think of the Plato's Republic, when you have this ascetic communism for the ruling classes and market and luxury and base enjoyments for the lower classes, for the working class. Well, okay, but you could say that Plato's Republic was antiquity, but it's interesting that this moral condemnation of markets and commerce didn't quite disappear with the advent of capitalism and modernity. You have, for example, in 18th century, a certain spirit of course, decisively modern political thought, such as that of Rousseau or Fichte, that was similarly neglectful or very distrustful of commerce. But on the other hand, you had, of course, in the same era, also the opposite kind of social thought, mostly coming from Anglo-Saxon areas, with the starting of political economy. So the more liberal thought that obviously had much more positive attitude towards the newly developing commercial order. However, if we look closely, at times these early modern endorsements of commercial, early capitalist society were at times much more, let's say, brutally realistic, less apologetic than the subsequent lofty stories about the benefits of perfect markets. For example, you have Bernard Mandeville's poem Fable of the Bees, with a telling subtitle, Private Vices, Public Virtues. I went reading that poem with expectation of reading some depiction how individual selfishness serves universal good, the usual story. But in fact, Mandeville's point is much more radical, but much more scandalous than that. In Mandeville's poem, private vices don't just simply refer to selfishness, but to the whole spectrum of vices. You have corruption, dishonesty, cowardice, laziness, wastefulness. Mandeville's point is that these vices themselves constitute a social link. So they connect, in this society of bees, they connect two or more bees in crime against the rest of the bee society. And this chain of corruption binds the beehive together. To quote a characteristic passage of the poem, the worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. This was the state's craft that maintained the whole of which each part complained. This, as a music harmony, made jarrings in the main agree. So Mandeville describes a beehive that functions because the conflict and disagreement are the main social bond. And in the turning point of the poem, Jupiter intervenes and instills honesty all the bees, in hearts of all the bees, and then the society falls apart because the whole social order based on all pervasive corruption collapses and most bees just find themselves without anything to do. And I think that to add another example, we could also find certain similar attitude towards the markets in Hegel, because of course Hegel was no enthusiastic champion of market. It is today more often emphasized how skeptical he was of it. However, I think it is actually more pertinent to ask how come that he nonetheless did even though he had no big illusions about the market, he nonetheless did cut out quite an important place for the market in his system. Hegel's political ideal was had initially some much more harmonious religious republican character, and only in time Hegel's political philosophy developed to include as an essential part this dissolution of organic unity of society into the market. And all the while having no particular illusions about the actual effects of this dissolution. In Hegel's account, there is no faith in invisible hand. So he can, at the same breath, claim, in the same breath, he can affirm the necessity of market, civil society, and claim things like civil society affords a spectacle of extravagance and want, as well as of the physical and ethical degeneration common to them both, unquote. So Hegel's major political philosophy had a certain sense for trash. I won't go into examination of Hegel's arguments for this necessity, but we could say that Hegel, against his initial more spontaneous instincts, recognized this certain subterranean, subconceptual power of commercial society that cannot be negated, it can only be perhaps kept in check or controlled. So I'm claiming that in fact there exist two different pro-market narratives. The first, the official one, the one we are usually served, market is a mechanism of discipline and optimization that directs egoism and selfishness of individual in a way that is beneficial to society as a whole, in a way that serves the higher good. And here, so the market here integrates the society in some functional organic unity. But the second, more scandalous, less celebratory, but nonetheless affirmative narrative of the market, the trashy version of the narrative of the market, that we can glimpse in various forms in Mendeville or Hegel or in Hayek. In this second narrative, any such reference to the common good is gone, because the benefits of market are indistinguishable from its corruption. The dissolution, the dispersion of the society in the market is at the same time immediately also mode of its composition. So the point I would mostly like to make in this presentation is that the left, or perhaps center left, is prone to criticize the official narrative of the market. It criticizes the idealization of the market, which is an easy target, but also the wrong one. Because I think that the perfection of the market is not, in fact, the actual ideology of capitalism. It is false ideology of capitalism, or even we could say second-order ideology of capitalism. That is, it is ideology, that perfect market is ideology of capitalism. And there is in fact a real ideology of capitalism, the actual spirit that permeates it, that makes the capitalist market logic spread and proliferate, and is something much closer to this second trashy narrative. The promise of independent action that is in some sense antagonistic towards social totality, so the market that consists in forming secret private alliances against the universality, it consists in minor corruptions, in creative hacking of the existing situation. So a market that consists of actions that introduce a certain disruption in existing social fabric and that then calls for new action to countenance them. The unofficial, the underground ideology of capitalism is what I think is effective about it. Now I repeat, this is not to concede that market is better than plan. On the contrary, this inherently morally shady character of capitalism could be, in fact, another good reason to fight against it. And also Hayek's argument of tacit and local knowledge as the reason for failure of plan could easily be turned around and used to argue that market actors will have good incentives for keeping information that might benefit all private and secret. I mean, this is constantly happening, so it is beneficial in general good to fight for transparency. But my point is that it has to be recognized that at the very core of modern societies there is this built-in mechanism of resistance to instituting what is universally the best. And dealing with that resistance is what constitutes the main problem and object of politics. So the idea of the plan shouldn't be measured just as a distant future endpoint of the development, but it should be measured by its usefulness as a weapon of struggle. It should be measured by how much guidelines it provides, how much answers it gives to the problems here and now, before that distant end game of history. And in this regard, the plan doesn't seem to be terribly effective idea, or terribly attractive, particularly if we take it into account the defiant and hateful subjects that capitalism seems to be producing today, as we are witnessing in the general political mood of times. The problem that actually existing working class doesn't seem to be naturally inclined to political positions we would call progressive, and often it is the opposite, has, I think, something to do with this moral character of the market that I described. It has something to do with the fact that capitalism produces sinful and guilty subjects that have had to have forsaken their universality. And I think working class is not exempt. And this, I think, is the crucial difference from the Marxian classical vision of the working class as a revolutionary subject, but I cannot go into it. So the problem with plan I have is that it's an overdose of universality in a world where universality is apparently losing its grip. Plan offers little in terms of answers because it just repeats in intensified form the very hard dilemmas that already the less ambitious left political project have to confront. For example, you have dilemma between economic sovereignty and ease of access to external markets, or you have all the problems that are internal to organization of the public sector, which effectively is already a form of plan economy. And I mean, these are problems that are apparently hard to solve, but easier because they're less ambitious than planned. So I don't see how exactly plan could help in any way at all. So plan seems to me to have today the very same problems that it always had. Now it's the debate of plan versus market, or plan versus local versus dispersion of decision making. Is this well? It has this no super-removable tension, and no amount of processing power or complexity management will help that. Because, and this is the final point, the difficult art of political decision making, that is of producing unified political will out of this dispersion of private lives and private wills, is in the end, I think it's not about managing or processing any complexity. It's about exactly reducing complexity into some unified decision. So having a large computing power at your disposal doesn't help here at all. Thank you.